love to answer some questions.
That's great, because I've got some really interesting questions for you to answer. And you guys, please keep them coming in, because we've got a good little bit of time here to hopefully we can get through several questions. So the first one I had queued up and it went away on me. So you've addressed this some. This is a great question from Melvin. How to manage a smooth and easy transition from IT service management system based on ITIL v3 to the new version for those companies that already have a program in place with clear roles and teams, and how to easily put those in alignment to the new ITIL 4 guidance.
Yeah, so I think one of the concerns was, okay, we've done ITIL 3, now we've got to change everything, and you don't. A lot of the fundamentals of ITIL are still the same. It's still ITIL. I think version 4 very much is a philosophical shift more than it is such a difference in practices. And if you've got an established system in place right now, a technology, whether or not you're using one of the major tools, they're all really focused on an ITIL version 3 perspective. And the practices in ITIL 4 are only slightly different than how we set up processes in ITIL 3. So I don't think there's a significant transition there. I think from a bigger picture perspective of truly understanding, what your value proposition is and how to engage with the business, how to set up a service catalog, maybe slightly different than what you have today, is probably the best way to start to transition to version 4. But as I said, it's more of a philosophical thing. I think it's more of a better way to engage with the business. To start to also incorporate some of those other best practices. So I think there's some better ways of how you integrate things like Agile and Lean and DevOps into this. And I think those touch points are a little bit better known. But it's going to be a gradual change. As I said, when I first looked at ITIL 4, trying to understand what the difference is between 3 and 4, it did not hit me at first. It took a while. And I think you'll start to see this as you go through training. You read the books, start to understand how things in the service value chain really apply to the way you do things. It'll become a lot more sensical. And as I said, so right now, I don't think there's much that you need to do from a big shift from a V3 practice capability. So those processes, I would keep doing things the same way. As I said, start to look at the value proposition, start to look to see how you can organize things a little differently.
Well, and that's the perfect segue into the next question, Mark, which is they'd love to hear you talk about the types of value or how value is defined in V4. And I know if you could go back to that slide that you have, probably be helpful.
So the V4 slide stuff in this one here.
Yes. All of a sudden, I was like, I've looked at a lot of presentations this week. Hopefully it's in there. So I'm glad it was.
Yeah, so value, and it's from a different perspective here, right? So value is what your customers perceive it to be, right? So there's this co-creation concept of value. And that is both the service provider and the customer who share in the benefits of whatever that capability is, so that service, right? We talk very much in the terms of service, and I think that's one thing. If I had my notes right in front of me, we have a slightly different definition of service in 4, right? I think I have a definition right here. It says means of enabling value co-creation by facilitating outcomes that customers want to achieve without the customers having to manage specific costs and risks. So it's slightly different than what the current definitions of service have been previously. But again, it's very focused on that co-creation. So the concept being is that the customers and the service provider have to work close hand in hand to identify what's valuable for each. If you think about it in terms of just true business, and if you buy something from an organization, or you are the business in a sense, the service providers provide services to their consumers. If those services no longer have perceived value, they stop being used, they stop being purchased, and the company goes out of business. So that value has to be understood by both the service provider for it to stay in business and it itself have value of existence, as well as the business itself as a consumer of it. It has to be meaningful for what its purpose is. Actually, when in this course that I teach, one of the first things that I start off with is understanding what you have from, a company. A company has a mission. They typically have a mission statement. Why does the company exist? And then they have a corporate strategy. And those corporate strategies then get broken down into all the different groups of strategies, whether or not it's a line of business on the operations side or if it's on the corporate function sides from HR through to IT. And each one of those strategies should map to the activities and services that they provide that map up into the service value chain, right? So we now connect what the organizations do to map into what the corporate strategy is, what the corporate's desire is to create, its overall mission. So that, I don't know if I answered that question well enough, but I think that's really kind of a different perspective of what value and what we need to be thinking about and start mapping that value between the business and IT as an extension of a service value chain.
Well, and I'm just going to throw in there too, Mark, as we've talked about, one of the things that I really love about ITIL 4 is that the definition of a service has changed. And in that change is the words value co-creation. And so I think that the service value chain takes something that people were looking at very linear, even though it was a life cycle in 3. It was sort of people started here and they did it in a very linear approach. The service value chain really ebbs and flows throughout the guidance now, and it just, to me, it makes so much more practical sense.
Yeah, I think that's the hardest part to understand around version 4. I think from the value system itself, it makes sense. And to me, there's a very straight line between, a business desire for certain capabilities and an IT's contribution to that. But for us to go enact those services, you're right, it's not so straight, and it's not the cycle that we saw in V3. It's leveraging the service value chain, pulling in the pieces that we need. Not everything applies to everything else. And for those who haven't seen the ITIL 4 books, I think the one thing I really liked was if you go through the different practice areas, it highlights which parts of the service value chain play a significant contribution to that practice. So, are we engaging? Are we, are we improving, or are we planning? And pulling in the appropriate practices. The other thing that's very interesting around ITIL 4 is the overlay of a lot of the capabilities, right? So from a practice perspective, they also are not so linear and independent. There's a lot of overlap with how you're going to apply those practices. So you've got, relationship management, which is going to be applied in all sorts of things, like how you engage your customers, how you engage your suppliers. So, those practices are going to overlap all sorts of different places. So I find it very interesting.
Well, thank you. And Royce has kind of a two-part question. And Royce, if I'm not asking the first part correctly, please chat back in for me. But I think the question is, inside of organizational structures, where do you see most ITSM programs lie?
That's an excellent question. If you have a group, I think this also depends on how large you are as an as an IT organization. But in most cases, when it's in an IT organization, you may have a separate governance group. I've seen separate service management organizations that literally report into the CIO, and they oversee a lot of the internal tool systems that support these practices and processes. They manage the process oversight, so the governance perspective. So a lot of the process owners may fit into that organization. Then there's other places where it's a lot more matrixed, where there's maybe one person who's kind of got that head from a service management perspective, and that the rest of the roles and responsibilities are distributed throughout the organization appropriately. Different heads may have different process ownership and process management oversight, and the tools might be in the infrastructure team, or it might be in a tools group. But there can be very different ways of handling it. For larger organizations, having that separate service management or governance group, I think, is the ideal place to put it.
And I think organizations that are really successful that we work with have an SMO, a service management office, and a PMO, and they're dotted line or tied together. They work well together, but they're not, one doesn't live inside the other. I've seen that work really well at some large organizations. And then speaking of seeing things, Royce's second part, and I know, Mark, this could be a whole hour for you, and we only have 7 minutes left, and we have a few more questions, but I love this question. What have you seen that works the best in terms of organizations rolling out a service management program?
Oh boy, how do I get started on this one?
I know. Sorry.
I think one of the key things though is communications, right? So what is the program, defining what that is, and then I think really understand the roles that people play, and obviously why are you doing service management in the first place? What is that value? If you can't connect it to value, you can't connect it to the business and why you're doing it. It can't be an isolated piece, right? But setting up, let's just say you've addressed that part, you have purpose of why you're implementing service management. I think really it's getting people involved, having people understand the philosophy of service management. So a lot of that has to do with communications. And maybe we'll have a whole webinar on that one day.
Right? There's a lot of these questions could spur a full webinar. So Jessica is asking, and to some extent you have answered this, and Jeffrey, your question's next. How do we get started moving our organization from ITIL 3 to ITIL 4? And I think you said earlier the guidance is a great place to start. So if you want to just expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think if you look at the ITIL service value system, which I still have up on the screen here, you really looking at the guiding principles as a key way of just starting to change the philosophy. If you don't have good governance in place, establish a governance and then start to adopt some of the governance practices that are identified in version 4. And again, also just having continual improvement. That philosophy that you use in V3 very much applies. So I think you start with putting that service value system in place. The practices and that service value chain will be the ultimate evolution. And over time, you can start to convert your thinking from a process perspective into a practice perspective, and you can start to map, what the relationships are. It's actually an exercise that I had already done, is mapping, version 3 processes and functions to the ITIL version 4. And you'll see that, in certain cases, there's a direct almost 1-for-1. In other cases, there's a pretty significant difference. But I think that's what your transition over time is. But for getting started, really start to think about the guiding principles, apply them to your governance.
Well, and Mark, I'm so glad you just used the trigger word governance, because I realized that we have one more poll that I'm going to throw up in just a second once I put out Jeffrey's question. So I like to think of technology in terms of physics. The machine either works or it doesn't. Right on, brother. Technology is inherently abstract and fragmented. Value comes when we make the abstract tangible. Perception drives adoption. One of the core weaknesses I found in ITIL is how abstract it can be. And because that machinery is not clear, it is much more difficult to adopt. What are the structured ways ITIL is architected and designed? What use cases reveal the machinery of ITIL working well? And Mark, I'm going to answer part of that for you. Jeffrey, Axlos has been doing a good job of publishing case studies, and I'll go pull some of those links and throw them out at you. But they've rolled out several in the last year in all kinds of organizations, from sort of unicorn like a Spotify to finance. And I think that will help answer that question for you. And then Mark, anything to add to that?
This is a conversation I have with CIOs all the time. This is a much bigger question than just service management, which is how is that value of IT recognized by the business, and how do you engage properly? There needs to be a very good two-way conversation between IT and the business, and a lot of times it's not. It's a budget conversation. IT asks for money, and the business then gives them a budget and expects the world. So really, I think from a quantifying perspective, you have to be able to understand what the outcomes that IT is delivering and be able to measure against that and make sure that's mapped to the value that the business has asked for. But I think first part is set yourself up for success in the beginning. What are the services that IT should be providing? And the business has to agree to that. The business has to ask for it. We have to stop that IT is trying to handhold the business through this so much. The business has got to take ownership of what values they need And then the IT organization has to be very responsive in providing that and creating a good value proposition of a capability for cost. And then we should be able to measure against that, and we have to measure those outcomes. And there's a whole other thing on how you measure experience levels, right? Lisa, we've talked about that. This is one of those cases too. You have to be able to quantify that. What is the outcomes that people expect and measure?
And I think that the way that value is defined and used in ITIL 4 is very in line to, inside of DevOps and the DevOps movement, value stream mapping is really a core component. And so I think that the mapping of the value between, sort of DevOps initiatives are often started in the development side of the house, where ITSM initiatives almost always started out of the operational side of the house. And to me, I see the concept of value and everyone talking now about value is one of the great bridges between the two.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm going to throw up this, going to launch this poll. So if anyone who's not looking at your screens, if you guys can just come back and, tell us where you're landing. And then there were, as I said in the beginning, there were a bunch of really specific questions, like since change control's role is much reduced, how does the RFC process now work? A lot of that kind of stuff, and there were a lot of questions about the ITIL 4 scheme. Those were answered in the first two webinars that we had. Obviously, and always, if you have any questions like that, feel free to come on to our chat on the website. That is staffed by subject matter experts, and if we can't answer the question for you right through chat, we can get you in line with someone who can answer those for you. And of course, there's always the ITIL Foundation class, which we are going to send out a 10% off promotional code for you guys. The next class is in April. I'm sorry, I don't have that date in front of me, but I know we have several ITIL 4 Foundation dates currently up, and as always, that's a great way to learn that level of detail. And I'm looking. Oh, good. Well, you're starting to get a lot of great presentations, of course. Thank you so much, Mark. Let me shut down this poll. And let me share it out. No, well, 53% are still sharing out figuring out the destination, and 41% know where they want to go. So that's super exciting.
Oh, that's great.
So it is 12 o'clock. I did want to let everyone know next month's webinar is going to be super exciting. DJ Schling, who is the Global DevOps Security Manager for CVS, will be back with us, and he's going to be talking about the DevOps experiment, something that he and a group of DevOps evangelists have been working on for the last couple of months now, and he's going to share out a lot of those results for us. So he's a great speaker. I think the topic is timely and interesting. You guys will be getting the invitation for that. Hopefully you can join us again next month, and feel free to bring in team members from your DevOps team, because DJ is always a fantastic presenter and is really a leading thinker, which clearly I'm not, a leading thinker in the DevOps space. So, so Mark, any parting thoughts for us?
No, I think I just want to thank you for the opportunity to present here. I enjoyed it. Obviously, if people have questions about ITIL 4 or even just the ITIL 3 journey, feel free to reach out to me. You guys have my contact information. I'm also out on LinkedIn. But thank you so much, and good luck on your journeys, and till next time.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.